I am your friendly moderator for this first panel. I want to thank Tanya for inviting us to this symposium and Wake Forest for hosting us, and to CANA, of course, for sponsoring this event, supporting this event. So I'm looking forward to some lively talk about death today, which is always good. So the panelists we have here, of course, are Katrina Spade, founder of Recompose, which I first knew as the Urban Death Project. Sorry to dead name your company, but that's him. And then we have Barbara Kemmis, right, executive director of CANA, and Victoria Haneman, law professor at Kenyon College. Creighton College. I'd like to thank Victoria Haneman first for drawing attention to the need for policy level reforms to the US death care system, which she has done through her work on funeral poverty and her work on strategies for incentivizing green disposition choices. This is a direction my thoughts have been moving in lately too, and I hope to find other fellow travelers here today. Additions to the slate of disposition technologies now available in the marketplace, along with shifting, albeit slowly shifting, public attitudes towards status quo death care practices, coupled with the growing public acknowledgement of and concern for global environmental health, really should provoke careful reflection on some of the fundamental assumptions driving status quo death care infrastructures and practices. And these changes should in turn provoke the contemplation of a comprehensive systematic reform of death care policy. Given the sheer scope and scale of concerns driving the imaginaries and rhetorics surrounding new disposition technologies, we should think carefully about whether, how, and with what consequences these technologies can scale up to meet the global challenges to which proponents of these technologies draw attention in order to motivate interest in these technologies. I should also note that when we think through this, we cannot assume that scaling up simply involves the mere application of existing knowledge without requiring further research into the new problems imposed by scaling up. And as Dutch philosopher Hans Ratter has pointed out, this research must attend not only to the feasibility of scaling up, but also to the desirability of scaling up systems. In the US, death care is grounded in a free enterprise and supposedly consumer-driven environment. Call it a private consumer provider model for death care policy. Exciting or not, new disposition technologies are being introduced into this policy model, but without much thought about the rationale or value of the consumer provider model itself, and without much thought about possible alternative models for death care policy. So what is possible if we draw our attention away from the disposition technologies themselves and instead examine the industrial ecosystem that shapes and gets shaped by these new technologies? So please indulge me as I go through just a few thoughts and introduce a topic to which all of the panelists, I think, share an interest in some way or other, namely how thinking about death care at large scales might give us pause to rethink death care policy or rethink death care at a policy level. So this doesn't mean ignoring or looking past new death care technologies. No, but it does mean looking into those technologies in new ways. So let me begin by looking into the three technologies that Victoria has identified as possible targets for tax incentivization, namely green burial, alkaline hydrolysis, and organic reduction. To think about these technologies clearly, we should follow seminal philosopher of technology Langdon Winner's advice and look not only at the uses of the technologies, but also the whole life cycle of the technologies. Their inputs, their outputs, externalities, and the way these artifacts impact our shared form of life. So let me briefly illustrate what I mean. So first, alkaline hydrolysis, which continues to gain traction in the US and overseas, despite the Virginia Senate's recent failure to pass HB 52, which would have legalized alkaline hydrolysis, maybe next year. But I said that last year. We'll see. It's unclear to me how at large scales, fresh water consumption and the energy cost of alkali production are to be factored into the assessment of alkaline hydrolysis environmental impacts. Billy Campbell in particular, I think, yeah, there he is. He's right there. Billy Campbell. Everybody. Yeah. So Billy Campbell in particular has voiced concerns about the high energy costs of alkaline or of electrolysis of brine in the production of sodium hydroxide. I think alkaline hydrolysis also uses about 300 gallons of water per cycle. What does that look like at scale, right? At scales large enough to render alkaline hydrolysis a significant factor in global climate change. This is not an insoluble problem for alkaline hydrolysis, I don't think. Pardon the pun. But it requires thought and planning. It's equally unclear to me how the transportation of organically reduced remains, a cubic yard, right? So about 500 to 800 pounds, right, of material. So how the transportation of this is to be thought of in relation to the environmental impact of organic reduction, and what might this waste problem look like at large scales, right? Enough to make a significant difference, right, to planetary health and overall organismic well-being. Moreover, there's a need to build infrastructure and to adapt other aspects of the political industrial healthcare system in order to accommodate alkaline hydrolysis, organic reduction, and green burial at scale. One simple example has to do with tracking the growth of these disposition options, something that will surely be of interest to funeral professionals, technology developers, wastewater treatment authorities, not to mention economists, historians, and STS scholars like myself. Consider the death certificate, right? It would perhaps be a good idea to track statistics, right, on alkaline hydrolysis, organic reduction, and green burial via death certificates. But what sort of changes, right? What sort of changes might we have to make to death certificates? Should alkaline hydrolysis be rolled into cremation without distinction on death certificates? Or should cremation have at least two subcategories, alkaline hydrolysis and flame, at least? How should we classify organic reduction on death certificates? Is it a type of burial, right? Is it a kind of cremation? Is it its own thing? Right? I'll be curious to hear Barbara's thoughts on this. There's a lot to account for just here, but I want to move on to something I think is even more important, something in which Victoria, Barbara, and I, and maybe Katrina, share an interest, namely broad death care policy. As I said earlier, ongoing material and attitudinal changes about death care practices should get us thinking about what it would mean to scale up the use of disposition technologies that purport to reduce the negative environmental impacts of death care. And this means thinking about death care technologies and practices at large scales. And the only way we can really do this, right, is to think about death care policy. The scale of death during the pandemic surely offered an opportunity to think a bit more carefully about the limits of the consumer provider model. The last few years have offered numerous chances to squander that opportunity, and glimmers of possibility shone through, but the angel of history extinguished them with her wings. What lesson could we still draw, right, from the COVID experience, the COVID pandemic? We have before us now in a single panel the entrepreneur behind Recompose, Katrina Spade, Barbara Kemmis, Executive Director of CANA, right, which is an over 100-year-old institutional funeral trade organization, which doesn't have a Wikipedia page. I don't understand that. Go figure. All right. And Trust and Estates Law Professor, and Associate Dean of Research and Innovation, Victoria Haneman. I think this particular panel presents us with a great opportunity to consider collectively what it would take to scale up the brick and mortar infrastructure for sustainable death care, and to think about what it would take from both a legal and policy perspective to further consolidate public interest in sustainable death care. And this may very well mean moving beyond nudge reforms, right? And the methodological individualism upon which those reforms seem to rest. Whatever this panel does in fact end up talking about, I hope the infrastructural and policy questions I'm raising will be part of the conversation. And with that, I want to turn it over to Katrina, followed by Barbara, and then with Victoria taking the anchor leg of this panel. So take it away, Katrina.
Thank you so much. Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Hello. Hi online as well. I am going to speak today about Recompose, the company that I founded in 2017 that was and still is proud of the fact that we were the Urban Death Project before that, a nonprofit dedicated to the same effort. So, and I'm going to talk a lot about what natural organic reduction, AKA human composting, is, because part of what I'm hoping to do today is get us all on the same page. So we're all, when someone says natural organic reduction, everyone in the room has a crystal clear understanding of what that is. All right. All right. So again, I founded Recompose in 2017 after developing the process of human composting. And Recompose brought that compost to market after spearheading legislation first in Washington State, and opened our first facility in late 2020. Some of you might know we're now legal, or the process of natural organic reduction is now legal in 7 states, including Washington, Colorado, California, Oregon, Vermont, New York, and Nevada most recently. I believe there's something like 12 to maybe 16 states that are considering legislation now around the country at different levels of, bills coming through, sessions, different levels of support, and different sort of statutes drafted. So there's a lot of momentum happening to continue to legalize this process. And just so you have a sense of scale, since that keeps coming up so far, we've composted just over 375 people to date. So what is natural organic reduction? Well, the legal definition in most states, in fact, that this has passed through as the legal definition, is the contained, accelerated conversion of human remains to soil. So that contained is important in some ways, because what we're talking about in every case is typically, I'll say every case for now, is a vessel of some sort. That's a container. And that container holds a human body and plant material. So NOR, I'll use to shorten natural organic reduction. NOR is technically composting. Who in the room has composted or is familiar with composting? Okay, that's a good number of people actually. So composting is combining the right ratio of carbon materials and nitrogen materials. In our case at Recompose, we're using wood chips, alfalfa, and straw, and then a human body, which we have lots of nitrogen and carbon in our bodies. And that plant material is a perfect ratio also of carbon and nitrogen materials. So we're creating this perfect environment to have natural decomposition happen, and happen in a pretty accelerated pace. These vessels in Recompose's case are specially designed, and they're doing a couple of things. Number one, they're holding a bed of wood chips, alfalfa, and straw, and a person's body. And then at Recompose, we cover the body with a mix of the same material. So it's kind of cocooned inside of that vessel. And that vessel is also recording the temperature of the material inside. Composting humans creates a great deal of heat. The heat is not added to the vessel by mechanics. It is actually produced by microbial activity. So it's the job of an NOR operator and an NOR provider like Recompose to understand how to create that environment inside the vessel so the body will break down in a relatively short amount of time. And then the resultant soil is safe for use on plants, trees, and gardens. Okay. NOR is emphatically not burial. So a lot of folks, oh yeah, we've been doing this for forever. You put a body in the ground. That's green burial. It is the inspiration behind, for me anyway, doing human composting. I would argue that green burial, where you're placing a body directly in the ground, is a, first of all, beautiful, absolutely natural process that's mostly going to be useful in rural locations because you need a lot of land. So the idea behind Recompose and creating natural organic reduction was, what is the sustainable option for us if we live in cities and if we're trying to serve billions of people eventually? So again, the resultant material is safe. It's just, in fact, biologically almost identical to compost you'd get at the nursery. So it can be used on plants as, in your perennial garden as top dressing, or mixed with topsoil to actually plant new perennials or trees or gardens. I'm going to speak mostly about Washington State regulations. So in Washington State, the soil created from NOR is treated the same as cremation remains. So in Washington State, you can scatter ashes as long as you have permission from the landowner. That is the same with NOR soil. So it doesn't need to be buried, and it doesn't need to be scattered in a cemetery. Again, that's Washington State, and different states have different rules and regs emerging. And then finally, if you're all going, what about the bones? Because that is the #1 question that we have. The bones are reduced during the process. In fact, for Recompose, it's like perfectly midstream in the process. We're reducing bone via essentially a large cremulator. And then that reduced bone gets reincorporated into the soil. So what families get back, or what is donated to conservation efforts, incorporates that reduced bone. Why do this? Well, first of all, similar to alkaline hydrolysis, there's a lot less energy used to compost a human than to cremate them. Now that includes the cremulator machine that we use. That includes the driving of trucks around when we have, say, plant material delivered to our facility. We've done an extensive life cycle assessment looking at what are the inputs energy-wise and carbon-wise, and what are the outputs. What we didn't do when we initially did that life cycle assessment was consider the benefit to plant life and forest when nutrient-rich compost is applied. So if anything, it's probably likely we're undercounting the benefit, environmentally speaking. So, but the number we're hanging on to for now, although I think it may rise, is we're saving over a metric ton of carbon per person compared to conventional burial and cremation. So, I don't know if you're like a carbon footprint person. That's a decent number. It's not going to solve climate change. But if it becomes the defaults like cremation is, it's a really great tool in that toolkit. And then importantly, the way I see this option is it has the potential. It's another offering for funeral homes to add to their list. So that cubic yard of soil. Okay, about 5 years ago or so, I was talking to a group of elders at a senior living facility and talking about what I was trying to do. And I'm trying to get a human composting, like, first of all, the law passed, and second of all, then we'll open a facility. And Linda Wolf in the back row raised her hand and she was like, Katrina, what? My family does not want a cubic yard of soil. What are you going to do? I was like, whoo, Linda, great question. So That set in motion are looking at really what are the opportunities for the use of that cubic yard of soil that every person's body creates. And by the way, we create that because of so much plant material that we use with the body to compost it. So about 50% of our clients come to Recompose, meet our team, bring a truck or a SUV, and drive away with about 20 bags of compost. They're like, again, back to the nursery. It's like if you went to the plant nursery and bought a bag of compost, we give you about 20 of those. They used to be your person. So about half of our families do that. And then the other half donate most or all of it to our land program. We have partnerships with conservation organizations, nonprofits in the state of Washington that have use for this nutrient-rich compost and also see the benefit of connecting people to their mission. So there's this kind of really beautiful relationship there, and our families can choose to donate the soil to our land program, and it will then go to one of those conservation orgs to do the work. As you know, we live on that way. Record keeping, I'm going to touch on briefly. We have similar record keeping to ashes from cremation, but no marker is necessary. Just like you can go scatter ashes somewhere, you don't need to mark where you've placed that soil. And to be totally honest, all of those molecules that were you once are now compost and are going to go on to be taken up by that tree, that bird. You know, it's actually going to be moving on into the greater ecosystem anyway. So though people can choose to have a marker, in fact, you could have a conventional cemetery marker if you like. There's no need for it. And it's not, in my opinion, it's not even necessary to bring that meaning or mark that moment. All right, and I'm going to wrap up just about with talking a little bit about licensure and staffing. Again, I'm talking about Washington State here. Our facility in Seattle, which I, by the way, welcome all of you, come for a tour. We give tours about twice a week, and it's a lot of fun. Believe it or not, it's a lot of fun. We are a licensed funeral home in the state of Washington. We are also a licensed NOR facility. The people who work on our teams, we've got funeral directors licensed who work with families, and then we have certified NOR operators. And those two teams are doing the kind of client experience and paperwork and legality side, and then the reduction of human remains. Two of our operators used to be crematory operators, actually. And some of them worked in different fields altogether. But it's a really interesting group of people that are, I would say, they're craftspeople in a way. They're taking these bodies, they're using science and a little bit of art, and I'd say a little bit of the magic of composting to transform bodies into soil, which then goes on to grow new life. The certification for our NOR operators right now is part CANA. It's part in-house at Recompose, and we do a heck of a lot of in-house training for our operators as well. And then the Funeral Board of Washington certifies the operators. So after they've received that CANA and then Recompose in-house certifications. In terms of record keeping, we have a chain of custody like any funeral home. We're keeping in-vessel temperatures because that indicates pathogen destruction. So we need to show that the temperatures were high enough to make sure that that soil is safe on the other side. We do soil testing, starting with every batch and then stepping down over time as operators providers show that they are meeting the requirements for safety. And then we also note and record the final location of that soil scattering. I'm going to wrap up here. I hope you now feel like an expert in human composting. You all will be certified on the way out. We'll pass out little medals or something. But just to give you a couple of numbers, just to give you a sense of where we are now, Recompose has been in operation again since December 2020. We've had over 375 clients to date. We also have a pre-need program called Recompose. Thank you. Recompose, we actually use a funeral trust for Recompose for we see that as a simpler offering to consumers. And we have over 1,600 people paid and paying on our Recompose membership. We've donated around 175 cubic yards of soil to conservation and restoration efforts, again, through nonprofit partnerships we have in Washington State. And then nationwide, there are 3 US providers of natural organic reduction. So Recompose is not the only one. We were the first to develop the idea and bring it to the legislature. We were the first to start operating, but we're no longer the only one. And in fact, I expect in the next few years, that number will rise. And again, I touched already on the states where it's legal. It's 7 states and counting. All right, that is my overview, and I welcome you to follow us online and all that good stuff. And I'll pass it back to Phil to keep going.
Thank you. That was great.
Oh, thank you.
Take it away, Barbara.
Hand
I will hand you the clicker.
Thank you.
Want me to click it?
Oh, no. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Excellent. And thank you for the overview. Now I really do feel expert in NOR. What I'm going to present to you today from is kind of the paths to legalization and regulation. It's not going to be as pretty or poetic as the previous presentation, but stick with me, right? Okay, we're going to have some fun. First, a little background. I do not come from the funeral profession. I am an association executive, and before that, I was a librarian, which means I can't contain my curiosity. All of this stuff is so fascinating. I want to learn more. None of this is boring. It's very exciting. And one thing that I've always loved about associations is our purpose is to do exactly what we're doing today, is to bring people together who have a common interest and advance the practice of whatever that is. My previous association was academic librarians, right? We had a whole different set of topics, mind you, but we still had a lot of fun doing these things. So thank you all for being here and paying attention, and everybody on the live stream. I can't wait for the questions that come when we're done presenting. I'm going to start with a little bit of history that kind of builds on the history that Caitlin provided. Yes, CANA has been around since 1913. And 100 years ago, the early practitioners of cremation were cemeterians. The cremation rate was well below, was negligible. It wasn't measured in percentages. It was measured in hundreds of processes. CANA believed cremation is preparation for memorialization. We still do. What does memorialization mean? It means ceremony. It means permanent placement. It means participation in building a tradition around cremation. Those are today's terms. Memorialization is still a term used in funeral practice, of course. Scattering was uncommon. In fact, CANA had a firm position into the 1960s that scattering should be illegal. So yeah, they still hired me, and we scatter in my family. So there we go. Apparently we've come a long way. In fact, pulverization of cremated remains was not commonly practiced, and that's true globally, actually, but became a common practice in the United States. And for the first 100 years, 1876 to 1971, 3 million cremations took place, okay? Now, when you fast forward to the last 50 years, basically my lifetime, there's a lot of young people in this room, but a lot of the people on the live stream and in this room, it's within your lifetime too. And for a lot of funeral directors and cemeterians, it's within their career span. Cremation has risen dramatically, from 5% in 1971 to 59% in 2022. We're gathering the data for 2023, but cremation has risen, grown, driven by consumer demand. I promise you, if I was that effective that I could persuade people to cremate, wow, that would be amazing. No, that's not what the association does at all. This is absolutely driven by consumer demand, and it's grown between 1 and 1.5% year over year. It's pretty predictable, and that's good. That's kind of good for business, right? To be able to predict that growth. And then a lot of the work that CANA does is try to understand why that happens. But what that means is 31 million cremations and counting have taken place in the last 50 years, exponential growth. And the concept of direct cremation was introduced kind of with the funeral rule. Just to add a cremation addendum to your talk, Caitlin, your history lesson, it's true. The emphasis was on embalming and burial, and even as recently as 1984, most stakeholders contributing to the cremation law to the funeral rule did not mention cremation. And so it was kind of added on because it was a new thing. And this concept of direct cremation or merely cremation without ceremony came into being. And I blame my colleagues in the profession for allowing that to take root. Because a lesson I learned early in my career with CANA, when we were doing some focus group research with consumers, baby boomer women specifically, was people do things with cremated remains. We tried to populate focus groups with direct cremation. I chose cremation, I did nothing. And cremation was service. I chose cremation, we had a service. We couldn't populate group one, couldn't find anyone who had cremated and done nothing. The distinction was chose cremation and done nothing at a funeral home or a cemetery versus chose cremation and held ceremony at a funeral home or a cemetery, right? We were able to populate those groups once we learned that lesson. So direct cremation as a concept in the profession is just that. It's a service provided that's cremation. And then the memorialization happens elsewhere. And that's completely up to consumers. So it's hard for CANA, right? Our roots are cremation is preparation for memorialization. So that was both hard to hear, but also good to hear that the consumers choosing cremation were actually memorializing while on their own. So in the profession, we often see direct cremation as a problem, and the solution isn't necessarily limiting any memorialization to funeral providers, but personalization and participation and crafting new traditions. That's what we promote now. All right. Now, getting into path to legalization. Why must we even legalize any of these things, right? I get that question from consumers and the media a lot. Why does there have to be an affirmative law to allow composting or to allow alkaline hydrolysis? And the answer is kudos to Dean Marsh. Tanya taught me everything I know about this. So if I get it wrong, she'll correct me. But but basically, by default, burial has always been practiced and therefore accepted as legal. And cremation originally was permitted locally, again, on cemetery grounds and kind of on a case-by-case basis. I don't believe there were early cremation authorizations or other paperwork required. My understanding is that those cemeteries started issuing those things until it grew in popularity. But starting in the 1980s is when we saw cremation laws go on the books. But the consumer protections in those laws really weren't about cremation as a practice. They were about chain of identification. Because and the other things on the slide, right to control, who can decide to do this? And then best practices around how to do this and how to, so containers, meaning the container the body is cremated in, as well as the container the cremated remains are returned in. Now, why? Why would this become important all of a sudden, right? Cremation is irreversible. If you bury a body in the wrong spot, you make that, a cemetery makes that mistake. Please don't do this at home, right? But if a cemetery makes that mistake, it can be corrected. It's not great, but it can be corrected. But if you cremate the wrong body or communicate the wrong thing or create any uncertainty around that, that's really appalling, right? That's the one thing we all try to avoid, is making any mistakes along those lines. So those laws, including model laws that CANA created, were mainly focused on those areas. How can we do this? Now, when we get to new dispositions, specifically alkaline hydrolysis and natural organic reduction, the path is interesting. If the Attorney General of any state, because I think you've all picked up on this, that everything is regulated and legalized state by state, right? It's a very federalist model. So there's no national law that's going to come in and trump all the state laws. No, this is going to happen state by state, and there's reasons for that. So if alkaline hydrolysis, when it was introduced in states starting in 2009, 2010, 2011, that area, was determined to be a form of cremation, it was legal. And so what we saw in the first wave of this was a lot of changes of definitions of cremation to include alkaline hydrolysis. Okay. If not, then the legislative process was necessary. And so some of the common elements you see up there, and I'm actually going to skip that because I got this handy little chart. Just gonna awkwardly look to make sure I'm on the right slide. Okay, there we go. So take a look at this. This chart is actually, can you see it at the font's a little small, but is actually contained in a position statement that we publish on our website on natural organic reduction. Because, well, we got the benefit of a primer on this before I spoke, so I don't have to explain anything. Most people really don't know what natural organic reduction is or how it compares to more familiar forms of disposition like cremation. So there are some differences, and this matters to legislators. Well, not so much to legislators, but to regulators, it matters. The details matter. I'll get into that. And so the path to legalization we need new legislation, as in Washington State decided to create a category of move away from the binary, basically, of burial and cremation, and created a category of reduction of human remains. And underneath that were cremation, alkaline hydrolysis, and natural organic reduction. That was a beautiful law. It was beautiful. It gave guidance to regulators and practitioners. It's clear to consumers. The vital statistics department followed suit. And so on death certificates now, whatever you choose, that's what's on your death certificate. They're the only state, to my knowledge, that has done that thus far. The other 21 states that have legalized alkaline hydrolysis, for example, did so as a form of cremation. So if you choose alkaline hydrolysis in that state, your death certificate will say cremation. And that's confusing and sometimes upsetting for consumers. It makes my job a little harder because we publish an annual statistics report. Getting to the numbers, we're trying to understand what's actually happening in the country, in the market. This is a tool used for my members for business planning. It's also used with the media and academics. And in the now 16 states that are practicing alkaline hydrolysis, 9 of them do not report alkaline hydrolysis separate than cremation. So I can't accurately tell you what the percentage of flame versus water might be. So there's some challenges with that. Okay, now the path to regulation is also interesting. I just have to pause for a moment and say that regulation gets a bad rap sometimes, right? I mean, it is barriers to entry by design. Sometimes we want the door wide open and to explore things, and sometimes there are bad actors. And without regulations, without laws, we can't take action on those. And regulators in particular get a bad rap because regulators are in the profession. Sometimes the staff officer overseeing the funeral board or cemetery board is someone like me who was hired to do this because they know this type of work. And they hear complaints from consumers, they inspect, they license, they oversee the profession that they're responsible for. It's a big burden. And they're limited in many ways because they have to follow the laws on the books. And so when the laws are detailed, like Washington State, great, right? They have a little bit more guidance and how to write the regulations and do that. When I'm going to pick on Nevada for a moment, when Nevada legalizes natural organic reduction as a form of cremation, I still can't wrap my mind around that, but sure, just slap a sentence into the definition of cremation and you're good to go. The regulators have a much larger burden to figure out how to write these regulations, how to create licensure, And a lot of the reasons that are up there are because, as you can imagine, with cremation, you get an air permit, you're working with emissions, you're working with zoning bodies, they're called different things. You're regulated at every level of activity, from having a business license to air emissions, all the things I said. But when you're working with alkaline hydrolysis, you don't need an air permit anymore. You're working with water reclamation. You're working with plumbing regulations. You're working with all sorts of things you can't imagine. And with natural organic, or you couldn't anticipate or aren't listed in the cremation regulations. So that has to be created. And the same thing with natural organic production. There's other agencies to work with. And so that's great because state and provincial regulators have those relationships often, or can form those relationships with their peers in other agencies. But it's new connections, new information that needs to be shared and offered. All right. Now, I want to talk about CANA's role, not as a blatant, shameless plug for CANA, although there's a little bit of that, so forgive me. But I think that's why, you might be asking, why is the Cremation Association of North America sponsoring this meeting, right? I've gotten that question more than once as we've promoted it, so I'll tell you the answer. The answer is that while CANA is over 100 years old, we've always been a progressive association. We've always been interested in promoting fundamentally cremation, but advancing the practice of that. And when there are new forms of disposition, it was CANA members by and large who were interested in those and practiced those. I say by and large because that wasn't true for natural organic reduction, but for alkaline hydrolysis, that's true. And the path to these practice of these new dispositions is often, you got to get out there and try it, right? Now, please ask permission from regulators and that kind of thing, rather than ask forgiveness, please. I'm speaking to the practitioners now, because it hasn't ended well for those who asked forgiveness. And yeah, they didn't keep their licenses or receive them in the first place. But you can do experiments. You can do, like Katrina explained, her path. So trade associations play a role in that because we convene meetings such as this, but meetings where we can talk about these things, we can identify best practices, we can share what's working currently and what we might want to tackle in the future. And that's what the purpose of those meetings are. Is to take practice to best practice, and then often those best practices become laws and regulations. So education and networking and conversation all contribute to that flow that ultimately ends up in regulation. So we got to keep talking fundamentally. And I'm just sharing CANA's role. For 100 years, we've done that convening. For about 40 years, we've had model laws to follow and also certification. And so here's the shameless plug, sorry. So we do offer certification, as was mentioned by a few people, including Katrina's staff have enjoyed this. We currently offer an online and in-person crematory operations certification program that includes both flame and alkaline hydrolysis content. They're not separate trainings. The 1,500 or so people that we certify in any given year go through that training and get both. And coming soon, I'm going to get in trouble if I give a date, because my staff person who's working furiously on this, Jennifer, is awesome, but I'm not going to. She's really close. So coming later in 2024, but really soon, I hope, we will have natural organic reduction certification. Now, let me just pause and say CANA's position is that natural organic reduction is not cremation. So we're not going to include it in the crematory operations certification program. It's going to be its own thing. But regulators who require, and I think it's 25 or 26 states now that require operator certification as a path to not quite licensure certification, but for these operators, they came to us and they asked for it. They wanted NOR certification as a way to maintain standards. All right. I have this last slide of questions for further discussion, but I think I'm over time, so I'm going to skip that and we can have that discussion a little bit later. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, welcome. Thank you for having me here today. I am going to be speaking with you about a topic that I do not believe is discussed often enough, which is the economics of death care service and the affordability of death care service. The cost for death care is estimated to be the third largest expense in the lifetime of the average American consumer. So I believe it's impactful that we're not having conversations about this enough. My broader research agenda is about the way in which federal tax incentives can be used or can be leveraged to sort of nudge or shape consumer behavior with the goal of disrupting in a positive way that impacts affordability the death care industry. And that's a lot to talk about in 10 minutes. So I feel as though I'm going to stay pretty surface level with this and really skim over some of these points rather quickly. We know that we're dealing with an industry that has projected revenues that will be in excess of $68 billion by 2025. To situate that for you, the health insurance industry has projected revenues of $25 billion. So this is a staggering figure in an industry that has, until recently, as Caitlin pointed out, remained relatively unchanged, despite the fact that businesses all around us are really changing rather swiftly. So let me start out with the first point of why is it important for a consumer to think about death care while they are still alive? We've created a norm of distress purchasing in the death care industry. We have consumers that are not thinking about death care purchasing until they are grieving, time constrained, unable or unwilling to do much research. Decisions are perceived as final. We know that cremation is absolute, and ceremonies that just don't feel right can't go back. You can't go back from a ritual perspective and redo a ceremony that doesn't feel right or undo a traditional ceremony in favor of green burial. There's also information asymmetry in the space. We know that, for example, the funeral home that is selected, that's an important economic choice, and yet fewer than 20% of consumers ever call or visit more than one funeral home. And of course, pricing is typically or often not available online. We also have etiquette uncertainty. The consumer is really unsure as to when they can push back when they are told that they need to do something, which leads to our second point. The easiest way to I'm too far ahead. The easiest way to bear an unexpected expense is to allocate payment over time. And so if we're going to meaningfully address funeral poverty as a concept, we need to think about ways consumers can reliably pre-invest or pre-save in this space. Funeral poverty is a very real concern. Fewer than 4 in 10 Americans can deal with an unexpected $1,000 expense out of their own savings. And research shows us that 60% of Americans as adults at some point in their life are going to live beneath the poverty line for at least 1 year. We know that cascading deaths can contribute to living below this poverty line for at least 1 year. And interestingly enough, we know that, or it's even more problematic in this space, because lower income families spend far more than higher income families on death care expenses relative to total expenditures. The wealthiest and highest income 1% of the population spend far less on funerals than anyone else. And this is not just relative to total expenditures, it's in absolute dollars. There's a lot of societal and cultural baggage as to why this could be the case. that I'm not going to unpack for you right now, but suffice it to say that access to credit and financial tools that are reliable is particularly important for poverty reduction. Death care expenses really hit the most vulnerable among us hardest from an economic standpoint, which leads to I can talk about that later. It's very interesting the way in which our social safety net is being fleshed out by crowdfunding. Which leads to point 3. We're contending with a really highly regulated environment, and there is an incentive to maintain status quo. You know, most regulation in this industry is happening at the state level. All regulation of prepayment instruments is happening at the state level. And it's fair for us to be concerned about the relationship between regulators and the industry. This is not a new conversation. This is a topic of conversation since the 1950s as to whether or not the industry has excessive influence on regulation that is being passed. It's a particularly important conversation because regulation that allegedly protects consumers can also create barriers quite intentionally to protect those who are currently operating in the industry. It is rent-seeking behavior. It creates obstacles to innovation. It creates obstacles to development of green technology, and it can keep costs unnecessarily high by reducing competition to maintain status quo. I could talk for an hour just about this, so let me just leave you with this example to drive the point home. Imagine if we put Blockbuster Video in charge of the entire video industry. Would we now have Netflix? And do we spend less through Netflix subscriptions than we did with Blockbuster? Not to date myself, but I remember the late video and rewind fees from Blockbuster. And I know that I spend far less right now through use of Netflix. There's a really compelling argument that the funeral industry is standing on the precipice of really staggering disruptive change, whether they want to be there or not. And there are a number of characteristics that exist in an industry that is ripe for significant disruption, which I can talk about during the Q of A. All of this leads to the work that I am doing with federal tax incentives. Federal tax incentives can be leveraged to nudge consumer behavior and sidestep regulatory issues to potentially facilitate disruption. An overarching problem that we see is that people want to pay a premium to not think about death right now. And that has a tacit impact on lower and middle income taxpayers who end up spending more on death care. In my article, Prepaid Death, this is the ultimate plug, by the way. In my article, Prepaid Death, which was published by Harvard Journal on Legislation, I consider the use of a pre-commitment device, a tax incentive to nudge consumers to think about death care now in the form of FSA accounts and using FSA accounts to help pay for lifetime spending on death care. My next article, Tax Sheltering Death Savings, is an adjunctive article to prepaid death. And I think about the way in which we can use a 529 plan death care equivalent using existing 529 plan framework and infrastructure to tax incentivize savings for death care. What is the 529 framework? Once again, this is an hour-long topic that I am distilling down into 2 minutes. You know, it's a tax incentivized way to invest in higher education. It was developed in 1999. 529 plans have been enormously successful, in part because of their ease and their simplicity There's no federal tax incentive for putting money into a 529. But once the money's in the 529, all growth is tax-free so long as a withdrawal is made for a qualified expense from the 529 plan. And, you know, there's an entire wealth industrial machine in the United States that leverages 529 plans. I have written about Dynasty Education Trusts, which we leverage 529 plans for. The fact is there are researchers that are dedicating considerable resources to the use of 529 plans in a more inclusive way. What does more inclusive use of 529 plans look like? Grant programs for initial deposits into these plans for lower income taxpayers, as well as matching contributions to a 529 plan. What would a 529 plan death account, I'm skipping ahead. This, by the way, is AI. And it's an AI depiction of what green burial looks like.
What?
It is. Now, those of you who are funeral directors can appreciate just how many ways AI is wrong in this, but I found it so amusing that I needed to include this green burial example. So this is an example of how PowerPoints on MacBooks don't translate to PCs, because these slides are not presenting quite the way they should be presenting. In this example, we have a taxpayer who is making a $500 initial investment to the 529 death account and 0 monthly contribution. At the end of 10 years, we have over $1,000 in the account. And I'm at the end of time. I will just say that I have many models of the way in which these accounts can produce staggering benefits for those who put relatively little into the account. I also compare and model out the difference in impact between funeral insurance and the 529, with the 529 really coming out way ahead unless you're lucky enough to die in year 3, 4, or 5 when you purchase the funeral insurance. But assuming that you're not lucky enough to die in year 4 or 5, or you're better off with the 529 death care account. You know, I guess part of what I would want you to take away is or why, as to why it's important to think about use of federal tax incentives, is because we know in so many ways in this country that our social safety net is falling short. And this is the one topic that I talk about as a professor, and I talk all the time, where I have people in the audience that will start crying because of the trauma of not being able to afford death care. And right now, we really are taking people and throwing them to the crowdfunding system when they have no place else to turn. And I would tell you that that exacerbates inequality in so many different ways, because crowdsourcing is really fueled by, or success of crowdsourcing campaigns, crowdfunding campaigns, is really fueled by narratives of deservingness. And we know that you are considered to be more deserving if you're white and young and attractive and have a really good story. And so I'm really interested in the way in which we can leverage federal tax incentives with the purpose of driving affordability. And I'm way over time, so I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Thanks, everybody. I think what I'd like to start with is asking our panelists if they have any questions for each other. I know I have my own questions, but I'd like to sort of see if you all have questions you'd like to ask each other.
Sure.
Yeah.
I've got one for Barbara. Okay, it's 2050.
Mhm.
Okay, I want you to
Okay. I know. this.
tell us about the funeral industry or lack thereof. I don't know. Tell us what's happening in America in the future of death care.
I'm really bad at projecting, projecting statistics. I can do that. That's math. I hope, I will say this in terms of hope. I hope there's more choice. I hope there's more ability to participate and personalize these, disposition services, experiences. I think I wrote down, I want to see this, that Victoria just said people will pay a premium to not think about death right now. We need to get over that yesterday, right? We just need to get over it. I think it's remarkable how many people still say, well, if I die, right? Okay, you might be the one, but doubtful. So anyway, but seriously, I think you're asking me about dispositions. Oh,
All
no.
of it.
Oh, it's
Yeah,
really
no,
wide open. I can
sure.
avoid that, but no, I won't. No, I really don't know what the ideal kind of distribution of dispositions would be. I think what's exciting is we're in this time of generational shift, right? So interests are really changing and decision makers are really changing, and that's part of the turmoil. So I'm a Gen Xer, so everybody overlooks us, right? Nobody asks our opinion. We just keep plugging away. But I'm really curious about that because I think baby boomers drove the direct cremation race to the bottom on price. We know that race is over, by the way. We know how much it costs to cremate somebody. It's not going to get cheaper. We're there. But what we haven't done is imagine how can we honor a life lived, right? How can we imagine how we're grieving now or not grieving, and the problems that come from grieving or not grieving, and acknowledge that there shouldn't be any stigma around that. So if the disposition mix, cremation is still going to be here in 2050. I hope composting will be too. I hope alkaline hydrolysis will be too. What's coming soon is, as far as technology goes with cremation, is electric powered cremation. We can see that coming very soon. It's already happening globally. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Do you have any thoughts, Victoria, about in 2050?
I have a lot of thoughts on everything. Yes. Thoughts on how things will reshape in 2050. I think that there are so many different ways that this industry stands on the brink of really substantial disruption, which I mentioned when I was speaking. We have market complacency, which is a traditional system that really holds a very substantial stake. And we do have innovation occurring within the industry, but it's a small sector of the industry right now, which is why I say market complacency. We have highly regulated entry barriers into the industry, which is another sign. Customer frustration, interesting tension points, consolidated power at the top, opaque cost structures, and outdated technologies. Now, as to the direction it will take by 2050, I think we're going to see a move away from traditional cosmetized, preserved corpses in open casket funerals. I think that's the only thing that I would predict with certainty, is that we seem to be moving away from that.
Thanks. I like this 2050 question because I think in terms of not just predicting, but in terms of sort of measuring our hopes. So you mentioned at one point, hopefully natural organic production will reach billions of people, right? Not by 2050, Right. But like if in your dream world, like how many people are going to be on board in 2050?
Thank you. Yeah, so we have big dreams. I like to say 30 years. That's, oh God, that's about 2050. But it's true that there's a fair amount of infrastructure that goes into creating a facility to compost humans. So it's not the easiest lift to get millions of people composted, or billions. But you know, I like to wake up in the morning and say, like, people have done harder things. So we'll figure this one out. But it does take a fair amount of infrastructure. Notably, we designed our system to go vertically so that it does take advantage of height. And so in populous areas, it makes sense to not take up too much, you know, square footage. But it's still going to be a big lift. I think my dream is that composting becomes the default. So right now, cremation is the default. People are choosing it because it just makes sense for them and it's cheaper. And so if composting can get to a place where people are like, I guess I don't care too much. I want to be composted. I'd love it if they weren't even thinking that hard about it. However, agree fully that everyone should be conscious on a daily basis that death is looming for us all. So both things are true. Think about your own mortality, but then get composted, but don't think about it too much. And the final thing I'll say on that is, you know, what's wild is, Barbara, I've heard you say so many times that CANA is helping with preparation for memorialization. And I think I had an epiphany about 20 minutes ago when you said that this time, where you know, Recompose is really sort of not about memorialization in the way I was thinking of it before. We are very much sort of like the antithesis of the granite tombstone. The concept of permanence is about as far from what Recompose does as you can get. We're talking about impermanence and that your molecules going all over the place and being part of this ongoing beautiful cycle. But what I realized is that memorialization and ceremonial experience are related. They're not the same thing in my mind anyway. I think of memorialization as a little bit more of like, I need that place where I'll go, that stone. And then ceremony, though, is something that we're seeing our clients really interested in. And so I don't think, I'd love to see in the next 30 years, people continuing to look at how to mark that moment when someone's died and how to really, and at Recompose, we have places, rooms, spaces in our building. And we have about more than half of our clients choose to have a service on site at Recompose. And so really continuing to offer, you know, experiences that feel meaningful and that are about ceremony, whether or not they're about memorialization.
I think that's beautifully said. And I would just add that when they say permanent placement, scattering is permanent placement. A cemetery is a permanent place. CANA did some research recently that revealed 26% of US households have human cremated remains under their roof. I would argue, right? Me too. I would argue households are not permanent placement. And when that research went further to ask, what are your plans to do with this? It was a very split generationally. And my own family experience is a perfect example. My mom's like, well, we're moving in with you. Dad's in my apartment now. We'll both be on your mantle, which I don't have. So, and that's not going to happen. They're not going to be on my mantle because I don't have children. So I will find a place for all of us to reside permanently. And mom is perfectly happy allowing me to make that decision. Doesn't want to talk about it. Many of you are nodding your heads online. You're probably reference or experiencing similar experiences. The students in the room, make room on your mantle, maybe, depending on what's going on with your families. But the important part is to talk about it. And I just also have to say, it was shocking in that research how few people recognize that funeral professionals, and I'm using that term broadly, like how funeral professionals can help this conversation. So people don't want to talk about it, but when they want to talk about it, they just want to talk to each other. Maybe they follow Caitlin online. They probably do, right? That's good. They're getting, that's good. A funeral professional, but they're not going to funeral directors. They're not going to cemeteries. They're not talking to doulas or midwives or any of the burgeoning community around this. And we need to talk about it. Talking to experts is okay too.
Yeah, I got a question. I guess to follow up, Katrina, because I don't want to let you off the hook so easy, I guess, with the idea that, oh, well, if we scale up hard, right, and fast, then, we've got, we'll have some infrastructure issues to face, right? And you said, look, we'll figure it out, right? But I want to hear more about like what you imagine the challenges will be, right? What does it look like for that technology to scale up quickly, right? How do you transport, like, so if we're talking about, a cubic yard of material times millions, right? And if we're talking about this happening, it's becoming popular in a place like, dense urban areas like LA or like, Chicago, New York City, like what does the transportation of this material look like? Or just what are the challenges?
Well, it is a lot of material. It fills a bed of a pickup truck, just to give you a great sense of what a cubic yard is, a standard pickup truck. And you can have it bagged and fill the back of a standard SUV. So it's an amount of material that's quite a lot to pick up. That said, once you've applied it to a garden, if anyone's gardened with a cubic yard before, they know that goes pretty fast. And if you have a small garden, that cubic yard will get used real quick. So I think that there's this, and I do think this isn't just you, Phil, there's a lot of funeral directors and some in the legislation, sometimes it comes up like, what are we going to do with all that compost? Well, trust me, we can use that compost. Soil is degraded all over the world, and there's so many places, including the organizations we work with, which have, one great example is one that was mismanaged in terms of the forestry in the 1930s. So the forests were clear cut, and then there was all this degradation of the soil on this 700-acre property. The soil then did runoff, and this is now a place that needs biomass and nutrients. And it's 3 hours drive from Seattle. So yeah, that's a bit of an expense for Recompose in terms of what we like what we do on a daily basis, or say monthly basis. But it's also true that there's lots of places that need good compost as a soil amendment to build back soil health. So I don't think that the soil piece, even though it can sound kind of large, is really that much of a barrier to this. It does take companies or organizations making partnerships and networking with organizations that want it. Although some providers just have a piece of land that they're using for that soil. And again, you can really place a fair amount of that compost in somewhere and have it be used.
I mean, I just as I was hearing you talk and I just sort of imagining the sheer volume of material, I start thinking like, wow, maybe this could be an export, right? To play, I mean, I'm just thinking very creatively, right? Like, so like, I mean, why not, right? If there are places in the world that need, more soil, right? Where the soil has just been depleted, or, could this be like an export, right? Could this be part of like international trade?
I think there's enough locally usually. And well, as a early designer, the dream was to have that soil used as much as possibly right in the cities, because what needs more green than cities? Well, nowhere really. And so you'd be surprised at the amount of space of like garden it takes to use a cubic yard. It's not quite as much as you might think. So the dream, my favorite story, person named Wayne, and he allowed us to use his name. He died and Recompose composted him. And his sister Marie came and picked up the whole cubic yard. This was in Seattle at Recompose. She brought a little trailer. She took that trailer back to the neighborhood where Wayne had lived most of his life. And his neighbors, his friends and neighbors, all came with 5-gallon buckets. And they met Marie at Wayne's old house, and they got some buckets of soil and took it, to their Seattle neighborhood gardens, their small gardens. And they're all still gardening with their friend Wayne. So that's the dream.
Okay. I've got a question for Victoria as well. So instead of, I mean, if we were to think just a little bit differently about kind of our death care infrastructure, our death care policy, right? So if we, instead of tax incentives, right, why not like tax support for death care? Like, why not something like, kind of universal death care, right? So there you could have public-private partnerships, through this where, you have, the federal government, say, negotiating prices with providers, right? And having certain requirements for, if you're going to be a provider in the system, you have to offer, certain kinds of alternatives. Your pricing has to be like within a certain kind of bound, like as a way of controlling costs, but also increasing, you know, giving an incentive, right, to businesses to provide, new alternatives, right? And to, maybe help try to reduce some of the negative environmental impacts of current death care.
Okay, there's a
practices.
few different parts to that. So let me start with universal death care. I wrote a book called Making Tax Law. And so the tax political process is a very important part of that conversation, right? Because you can come up with any idea, but if it's not feasible and it's never going to happen, why waste time talking about the idea? In the United States, initiatives with the word universal before them don't succeed politically. We live in a time of swiftly escalating healthcare costs, education costs, and housing costs. And death care is not a topic that people want to talk about anyways, and it's really not viewed as a priority. And we label any universal initiatives as quote unquote socialist. And so until our sense of community over individual shifts, universal death care as sort of a branded product, I think would actually be kind of disastrous for the politician that pitches it. Now, I can tell you that I am capable of delivering what is essentially a universal product. It's universal death care support to lower income and middle income taxpayers through the 529 program that I did not detail to you because I didn't have enough time and my PowerPoints are broken. But I can essentially, through tax incentivized savings, which receives bipartisan support, deliver a tax subsidized program that would help the most vulnerable among us. I've just rebranded it as something different. I've rebranded it as something that is capable of getting political support. I have received calls from senators about the FSA product and interest about the 529 product. It's just a matter of creating political urgency around it at this time. I think there is interest in it. Now, the second part of this is, can you then shape where the tax incentive goes based upon conditions that are placed upon receiving the tax benefit? Absolutely. We can say, for example, that through the 529 savings plan, we're only going to tax shelter savings for traditional funeral products to the extent of $3,000 per lifetime per taxpayer. But if it's a green product, that we will approve up to $5,000. There is a way to sort of condition delivery of the incentive, or in other words, like parenting a teenager. Here's a benefit, and here's the condition to receive the benefit. And we can shape a tax product or a tax incentive in that way.
Thanks.
Wow.
What do you see as the challenges kind of that we face going forward in terms of kind of growing the kind of sort of death care future that you would like to see? Like, what are the main challenges?
Yeah, and some of the challenges we're facing in the profession right now is a general lack of trust. Public trust is waning all over the place, but there's funeral directors are rarely thanked, rarely featured in positive ways in the media. And, I thought of this particularly during the pandemic. My wife is a nurse practitioner, and everybody, she was wearing her her scrubs or her credentials or whatever, would thank her for her service, right? During the pandemic, it's waned, but there was never a sign, thank you funeral directors. And they were last in line to get PPE and, um, what was it that we got that protected us? You know, the shots. I'm sorry, I lost the word.
Vaccination.
Vaccinations. Thank you very much. Sorry, last in line. Lost the word. You know, and no one complained about it. I mean, really, no one complained about it. In fact, there was a situation where one of my members was up in arms because a rival funeral home put an ad in the paper, basically thanking funeral professionals for the work they'd done. And he thought, we don't need to be thanked. We're doing what we're doing. And that's by and large the attitude, right? It's so fascinating to me that death care is universal, not in that sense, but in the sense that we all experience it. And in the recent funeral rule review, one of the questions was about, do people have access to death care services, right? And it was the last topic, and it was like, well, wait a second. Yes, when that call comes in, somebody leaves within an hour to pick up that deceased person. There's challenges of funeral poverty and funeral deserts in rural areas, and that comes to staffing. We have a staffing crisis, as Caitlin pointed out. We do not have enough new people coming into the profession, seeking licensure to replace the retiring licensed professionals. We have hundreds of people on this live stream who are interested in death care, but probably do not have it on their to-do list to enroll in mortuary science or funeral service programs. So how can we kind of, well, have a conversation like we're having today, but figure out how to do that? Because I'll tell you, the staffing crisis will have an impact on increased prices for consumers with death care. You're used to having I'm used to having a service within a matter of days, right? I'm used to I would expect when my person dies that I would get those cremated remains back within a reasonable time period. Well, in some parts of the country, some parts of the world, excuse me, the staffing crisis is further along than ours, and it's average of 2 weeks to get cremated remains back, possibly 10 days to have the initial meeting with a funeral director to plan a service. That's way outside our expectations in this country, but that could come to us. So those are the concerns I have right now. The barriers have been covered, and how do we overcome those barriers? We work together. Everybody has to do their part. Trade associations have to do education on living wages and good working environments and cultivating those, and small businesses, so we don't churn out these new licensees who seek better opportunities elsewhere. We're responsible for that as well. And we've talked about some of the other responsibilities. Yeah.
Thanks. When does this panel end? Oh, well, let's take some questions from there are from the audience. Excellent. Yes, your hand is so high. I will do that.
Elaborate on how a 529 death care account could fund memorialization or the ceremony. For example, if a family chose to have a direct cremation.
So how could the 529 funeral savings account support services, right? So like memorialization services.
I would love to. So you contribute money to a 529 account, and for it to be accessible, you would create as few barriers to that as possible. For example, allowing contributions directly from paychecks of very small amounts helps inclusive savings. And the money then compounds in the 529 over time. And the idea is that any qualified expense can be reimbursed through this plan without that compounded interest ever being taxed. As long as it is for a quote unquote qualified expense, you submit the receipt and you receive reimbursement out of the account without any tax being imposed on the appreciation in the account. Now, what happens if you die, what happens if your death care is paid for and there's still a balance in the account? The beneficiary can be changed. to someone else. And these accounts can be structured so that they are eligible for Medicaid spend down.
Yes.
What does it cost for a family for the NOR?
So what does it cost for a family to hire you?
At Recompose, the cost is $7,000. So just north of a funeral with cremation, back to those slides, and pretty much lower than a conventional burial, which I don't know if we have a number that includes a plot, but most people say it starts at 15 grand and goes up from there.
In the back.
So by 2050, you perceive virtual memorialization starting to replace physical memorialization, and what are the implications?
So can you repeat it again? Yeah.
You see a trend of virtual memorialization, but social media or web series or any of those virtual online options, placing physical memorialization, tombstones, et cetera. And if so, what are the implications?
So in 2050, if there were, yeah, if there were, right. But in the future, if there's, do you see a trend toward, Barbara wants to answer this, by the way.
I'm dying to talk about virtual memorialization,
okay.
which is the
Very-
point of your question, right? By 2050, is virtual memorialization going to replace in-person memorialization? We don't have to wait that long. We don't have to wait that long. Social media accounts are memorialized now. Live streaming, like we're experiencing today, or similar to what we're experiencing today, is possible. When my grandmother died during the pandemic, we had a celebrant service via Zoom. And, my family could participate. It wasn't 700 people. It was much smaller, but I would argue that's happening now and will continue. It was almost required during the pandemic, but it's something that's continued of interest that you can access that now. But as far as like permanent placement goes, there are services out there right now. And just as I couldn't come up with immunization, I can't come up with a single one of them now. But you can document where you scattered your person, like put a latitude, longitude pin in a memorial page. You can do that right now. You don't have to wait. So I hope all of those memorialization trends continue, and they're driven by consumers. Again, this is something obviously the profession will offer, but upon request, upon the desire of the family, right? Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Number one, just want to thank the organizers of the event for suggesting that there's a very varied group here with lots of different opinions and very strong opinions, possibly. I would submit to the panel that the future of death care in America is really missing the conversation and conservation burial grounds and how green burial integrated with land conservation and land protection is the future. For some of us here, representative of those organizations, we'd be very interested in your next symposium, potentially including our voices, to share the power of having a place that people can return their loved ones to, whether they're ashes or their bodies. The power of beautiful people in this room who make products that support these families and that give these families the opportunity to take a very personal and meaningful transformational experience with the end of life. So we'd love to be part of this. And if anyone in the room wants to speak to us, I'm part of this in North Carolina. Mallory was here, and she's another great advocate of conservation burial, and of course, our godparents of conservation burial, Billy and Julia Campbell.
So for the live streamers, that bit of silence was a wonderfully, I will summarize it as best I can, but a wonderful impassioned description of the opportunities that land conservation, burial, and memorialization can bring. And there are people here in the room who are going to have a vibrant conversation about that. And I just feel like I need to apologize to the group. I default to talking about cremation. It's what I do. There is obviously green burial, traditional burial, and burial is a continuum, right? It's a continuum, and there's so many points along that continuum. So I apologize for my limitations and defaulting to cremation, but I wish I could do you better justice with a microphone, but thank you. And let's talk in person. We're going to talk about it together. Those of you online, submit your questions about burial conservation. Yes.
Other questions?
Phil,
Well, we have no time. So
Oh,
I'm very
okay.
sorry. I'm very sorry. I just wanted to see how many people we had to say no to because we are out of time. But thank you all very much.
Thank you.